Okay, let's start out with a couple of the obvious things that we said we would address. So, Denon sound quality. I think the Denons sound great. I don't own the Pioneer CDJs, but I think that the sound quality is probably, I want to say, identical. Honestly, the reason the Pioneers are so popular is because they're the club standard. So when you play different gigs all over the city, country, world, whatever, you always know what you're getting. I'm sure they're rock solid, super stable. I'm sure there's a million reasons why they're the preferred option. But at home, for me personally, I don't really care about gigs right now. I'm having a great time playing in my basement. I played gigs years and years ago, and it was great. But for right now, I'm having a great time just jamming out. So the Denons are superior to me because you get dual layers per player. So one player, in my case, I have the 6,000 M's. You could pay $1,300, $1,500, $1,800 for one, and depending on the day, and you get two tracks inside. So if you're only mixing two decks, in theory, you could just have one player and you could access both. Or if you want to have the option of mixing four decks and or the ability to have redundancy in case one of them fails, which has not happened to me yet, but you never know, that would be the reason to own two of them. So I own two, and that gives me four decks of total play. And I'm not sure if the video is showing this edge or not, but what it allows me to do on a single mixer is mix up to 4 layers of Denon along with an extra layer of Ableton, which I use channel 5 for. And then on my V10, so on my V10 for the DJ kind of hybrid setup, I'll have 4 Denon layers going, and then channel 5 will be the push V10, or I'm sorry, yeah. Channel 5 will be the Ableton push layer. And then channel 6 is where I route all the mixer's internal effects and all the return effects channels so that I have some sort of control over things. And I'll show you what that means, what that looks like. For setup, so you basically on the Denon players, you just go to settings, which you get to by swiping down from the top of the screen. You hit settings, you go to services, and you enable Ableton Link with your finger. Once it's enabled, you go to Ableton and you also turn on Ableton Link. You'll see them start to communicate. You will have to set the downbeat manually, so as you watch the indicator roll across the screen, just wait for it to circle back to the first beat. That's when you want to start your phrase, your loop, what have you. So as long as everything is set up in Link correctly, I also recommend a separate router with a separate network that does not have any data connectivity. So I have a different router. It's an Apple router. It is not connected to the internet, and it's just down here in my basement, so I have a music network. It's just a local ad hoc. That allows greater stability and, in my opinion, less latency, or I guess a tighter sync. That said, oftentimes it's just easier for me to beat match manually if I'm trying to blend the two Ableton and Denon DJ worlds, but to each his own. And I should say, the further I go with this, the longer I play, the less I even use the Denons, the less I play records, and the more I'm just kind of making my own jams. But in terms of hybrid, being able to layer on top of stuff, we're going to kind of go over that now. I'm going to mute the mic, and I'm just going to jam out, and we'll talk in a minute. Okay, so we weren't trying to set any musical records there. The point is, you had some layers from the Denon players in sync with the Ableton rig, and you can kind of do some creative things. So it doesn't make you Richie Houghton by any stretch, but if you have all 4 layers playing on the Denons in little short loops, I would assume, percussion, techno kind of loops, and then you have your little 5th deck going on your push, that would give you the ability to kind of at least replicate the hardware in a way, and you could kind of experiment from there. So the mixer on the right, I was playing the V10 push combo through stems. So let's remove the Denons from the equation for a minute and just kind of forget about it, and we'll just talk about the mixer on the right. So you could connect the push with 1/4 inch to RCA cables and just run it in standalone, and just connect the RCAs to the back of the mixer and pick a channel, which could be, for example, channel 5. You could do 4 Denon layers and an Ableton layer. Alternately, you could just run it over USB, and that gives you 2 options. One would be to route everything through the master in Ableton and tell the master to be channel 1 and 2 on the V10, which would mean that your whole song would be routed to a single channel in the mixer, which would be similar to how DJs play. So if you're already familiar with DJing and you want to take your whole project and make it into a song and mix it on your records, mix it with your records. If you're already familiar with, DJing and that way of playing, then you could just send everything through the master bus, connect it with audio cables or USB, and run it to a single channel on the mixer. I prefer to run it out as stems. So I basically bring my track down to 8 groups, so that I can focus on all the groups on the push all at once, and I can trigger clips and things. And then by routing it as stems, that just means that I send outputs 1 through 10 out to the Denon or to the V10. So I send out 5 different stem groups from Ableton over the USB cable. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the V10, or 10 stereo outputs. And then I use channel 6 for the return effects on the V10, including my send external pedals, which in this case is a Zen delay and a night sky reverb. So this allows me to play with my song in stem format, and I'll show you what that does in a second. It's definitely overkill, but to me it lets me take a whole project and really kind of make it more alive, and really kind of unleash it and get clever and creative with different things and add new layers and find new textures. And so the simpler way is to route everything through one channel and then add beat machine synthesizers, DJ players, whatever you have. If you only have one mixer, that's a great way to go. I really tend to prefer the stems version, and we'll do a little demo now. Mind you, I have one hand, so it's not going to be miraculous. So the main idea, if I was using the push and sending everything to one channel, you can use your master bus in Ableton, which is great. You know, it gives you compression and limiting and a quick way to just make sure everything sounds nice and glued together. If your mixer doesn't have a compressor, that's really helpful. My mixer does. However, I'm using the analog heat right now, which has its own compressor, so I'm not utilizing the V10 compression knobs, but that's another story. So you gain the ability to keep the master bus intact. So your compression, your limiting, all those things still function really well, which is great. However, what you lose is the ability to affect each layer on the fly unless you're using Ableton effects. And the push is great. If you're just using the push to jam out a project on the table with nothing else, you can totally do it. There's many videos online of people killing it. To me personally, I'm always looking at a way to blend that with my other songs and kind of always thinking about it from the DJ mindset. So I don't love mixing levels with those little knobs personally. I'd rather have crossfaders and actual volume faders, which is why I have the V10. It lets me set my levels on the mixer in the push or on Ableton, or in Ableton rather, and then get the levels where I want them. And then on the V10, I have faders, which give me 0 to 100% of that level. So that gives me a bit more of a guarantee that if I want to throw a kick drum out and put it back in, that I'm going to get from 0 to 100 versus on the push. If I'm using a little knob, I may overdo it with the volume. You can use a utility on every track, which will let you reduce the volume by a certain amount. So for example, you could go in Ableton and for every volume fader, you could add a utility, reduce the volume by -6, and then crank the faders on the mixer on the computer to +6, which would give you a net 0. You could totally do that. You could also set the utility to -15 or -12 to make sure that when your fader's all the way up, your level on your channel is where you want it. I find that process to work completely, but I find it very uninspiring. So for me, I want to set my levels in Ableton relative to other tracks, give or take, and then perform those levels live on the V10 from baseline. So that's what I'm doing. The other benefit to the stem layers, aside from quickly pulling things in and out, is the ability to add effects to individual layers of the track only. And by that I mean I can send the hi-hats to the delay, but not the kick drum. I can send the vocals to a reverb, but not the bass. The stem functionality lets me do that. You can still do this on the push, again, by using your sends. If you go to the mixer and hit sends, go to send A, send B, it 100% works. It does the job. I just don't find it nearly as fun and inspiring as using the mixer. So here we are again. So a few ways to route the thing. I hope we covered that in depth. If you have a USB-enabled DJ mixer that's 2, 4, or 6 channels, I would encourage you to plug your push into it and play around with it. If you do not have one of those mixers that's USB enabled and you still want to play with stems, the alternative is something like the Model 1, for example, which is all analog. We'll do a little video just talking about those two next. But something that's all analog, for example, you would just need a big sound card. So I have the 16 rig from Arturia. It allows me to output 10 different stem channels or 5 pairs, which gives me the same functionality that I just showed you on the V10. You run the Audio 16 rig, Audio Fuse. You run the Audio Fuse 16 rig, and you end up with channels 1 through 5. The difference is you're plugging in a physical cable, but it's really not a big deal. And you get essentially the same outcome in the end, which is stem mixing. It's not for everyone. It's not necessary. You could certainly do this with less gear. You could spend way less money. And I mean, literally, you could put a push on the desk and connect your headphones and mix a whole song and perform it live and crush it without any stem mixing. So it really is just preference.